Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shub, and together with my partner and co host Patric, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Hey Patrick, how have you been? We're back again after a bit of an intermission.
Really? It feels like I just saw you.
Yes, I mean that's exactly how it feels like when you have been when you're part of the severed flow. That's how it feels like.
I did not see that coming.
See what I did there? See what I did there?
Season 1 or season 2 though? Have you seen season 2?
Okay, I have. I don't think it
I think
was as good
season
as
2 was
season
a
one, though.
huge
That's my
letdown. But obviously season 1 was so good. Expectation was very high.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't realize it, but actually that was not a bad segue for what we were going to talk about.
So how does a
Believe it or
VC
not.
have to sever their brain, Shub? That's our topic? Is that what it is?
I'll work with that.
Okay.
I'll work with that, Patrick. You often make my job harder, but I'll work with that as a segue.
I actually re-listened to the intro of our last episode because I remember that I completely set you up for failure on that segue, but we kind of saved it. So now here you go.
Yes. So where I was going with the Severance segue, or more specifically the season 1 and season 2 segue, is I think what you may say. I mean, it often happens when we watch these shows. It's a thing. It feels like it's almost like an inevitability of life. If you keep repeating a formula that's worked very, very well over and over and over again, at some point it runs out of steam because either it's not being done well enough, or it's lost its novelty, or very often it's not even kept up to pace with the times. A reinvention of the formula or an iteration of the formula or playbook was needed. um, I think a lot similar things can be said about similar phenomenon in business, in ventures, in startups. Very few companies last more than say 50 years. Much fewer last more than 100 years. There's I think only a handful which have lasted several hundreds of years across the world, leaving aside firms in Japan, right? Very few. And I think
Saint-Gobain, founded 1665.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
The
Okay,
US
well
founded
done.
1776.
Well done to them.
So, fun fact.
Or so at least we are aware of, right? I think the true answer is it's been around since the Big Bang Theory.
Okay, fair enough.
All right. So where I was going with this is, I think because our job, Patrick, is to look for ventures that will do well for the upcoming investment cycle, right? So say the next 5, 7, 10 years or more, it may be relevant to or similar or have similarities with what caused firms to be successful in the 5 years preceding today, but quite often it might not be. The success factors may change or at least evolve with time, and therefore it also means we as investors, or at least this is a hypothetical discussion, the answer could also be we don't need to change. But hypothetically, as investors, we also need to evolve with times. If, let's say, there is a code or a set of success factors or a playbook that's worked for us, is there a possibility that we also need to evolve with time, look at different models, retrace our steps for what the next 5 years look like? And so, if yes, how does one do that? If not, is that just a false confirmation bias where we think, hey, you know what, this worked for us, so it'll continue working for us in the future?
So I think it's a fascinating topic because there's a part of you and me and the wider team, of course, that we actively shape fundamental with some variation of that question in mind. I think it's more about competitive advantage, but it is sort of a recurring exercise that we are undergoing at least once for every new fund cycle, sometimes in between. So I think that's one thing. But there's another where I think there's an unconscious and not often enough made conscious part of your topic, which is what I'm investing in and what I invested in and what I learned really making me a better picker of the next thing that I'm investing in. It's sort of a very tricky subconscious thing in human experience or human psychology. So I find it fascinating that you brought this topic. Perhaps we can split the conversation a little bit. I have a few topics in my mind. Let's start with the first one. Let's go through examples of successful or spaces that have created repeatable successes. We can frame it. I mean, each of the successes will be its own ingredients, its own recipe, etc. But you can sort of draw lines around them and kind of space them together. And then let's have a debate whether they are still relevant today. So, obvious one being software as a service. That's been a theme since basically since we were able to put software in a browser, let's say 15 years plus. So has produced massive successes. Everybody can think of their favorite SaaS business, both enterprise, freelance SMB, and even consumerish. What about that one? Is that still relevant? Is it irrelevant? Has it taught us things that we should better unlearn?
So it's interesting you bring it up. So when you define it narrowly as software as a service, of course, you're shortening the horizon we look at. Now, the cool thing, because we've also, I forget which episode, but a few months earlier, we evaluated some very high quality SaaS businesses, looked at their financials and so on, and compared them. The interesting thing is, many of those firms were perhaps not necessarily software as a service the way we define it today, 15 years or so ago. So they would be more would now be called on-prem software or traditional license-based sales, etc. So this would be even firms like your Adobe's of the world, Intuit,
SAP.
Microsoft, certainly, all these companies, SAP as well. Correct, that's right, right. So one could say, hey, they actually went with the formula of selling a piece of hardware as a single time sale, bundled with hardware or without. And then eventually, at some point, completely flipped the model into a software as a service model with subscriptions. That's interesting. Actually, that's again. So you're outdoing yourself, Patrick,
as I have a
on
habit of
this
doing,
one,
yes.
right? So interestingly, that sets us up for discussion of how those companies stayed relevant by reinventing their playbook. Now, one way to look at it could be to say, hey, if you're doing well, the answer will come to you naturally. Another way to look at it could be to say, many other firms have perhaps fallen by the wayside or at least are not as good anymore, while the ones who adapted and reinvented their playbook with the times have since become much, much larger
I mean,
and
to
more
say with that
successful
example,
companies.
if you were an executive in the on-prem CD-ROM distributed version of Microsoft Autodesk or, I mean, SAP, not CD-ROM, but something like that.
Yes.
And here comes the age of cloud and the age of browser. What you knew about CD-ROM distribution and on-prem hosting, did that make you a better executive in the next version of the company, you think?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I mean, I wish I could answer. I don't know if I have enough authoritative knowledge to answer it with a clear knowledge basis. What I will say at the time, there perhaps was a tricky aspect of judging because the obvious trade off is with the on-prem license sale, you get like a big chunk of revenue in one go. Whereas with the subscription, you get a small piece every month. So if you look at it from a near-term effect, you'll go through a near-term effect of potentially losing revenue and losing cash flows and so on. so you probably need a lot of clarity and um I don't want to say visionary, but okay, let's go with clarity. You need clarity that this new direction will pay off, and you have the foresight and patience to see through it for a slightly longer term.
I'm not sure it made you a better picker. I think I'm a believer, and again, we're talking about VC. We're just using this right now as an analogy. I'm a big believer that this is the ultimate apprenticeship business in that it never stops humbling you, never stops teaching you, but also in that everything you have done in the past can be relevant for one big deal. 100% convinced of it. I've seen it. So in one way, with that in mind, I would argue, hey, that kind of an experience should make you, in some special circumstance, also make you a better picker in the new version of your own business.
Mhm.
But you're
Yeah.
lacking critical competencies that perhaps others have better and that made them also capable, or if not more capable, pickers of the new version of that business. So I think that reality is there. And we as VCs, we're exposed to these same cycles. I mean, the most extreme version of that is the Midas touch bias, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, there's a reason why they call that VC fame list the Midas list, right? Because people literally at some point think, oh my God, that person is so good at picking, they have the Midas touch, meaning they actually make the company. And because they invested, they became great.
Yes.
That's the implication, right? I think that's very dangerous, right? So you can get into a lot of confirmation bias the more you actually see the same thing.
Mhm.
You can get into a lot of self-selection bias as soon as something doesn't fit the prior successes that you've had. And then the moment this kind of success stops working, that's when you become obsolete if you don't reinvent yourself. That's the whole, and
Mhm.
sorry, and especially if you're overconfident and self-selecting. I think that's that. Yeah. I mean, that's one example. We had the
Yeah.
age of mobile apps, Shub. I mean, how many startups have you have invested before me, and you have invested in consumer? I never have. You must have seen a ton of them.
Lots and lots of them. Um, but was your question on,
Is
how
that
do you
still a
prepare
thing today?
yourself
No,
to
right?
suddenly go?
That's not a startup. That's happening a lot.
I mean, it's a widely established theme. But if your was your question, hey, was there an investor cohort equipped to
Yes,
handle the switch from desktop based internet consumption and usage to app
for
based
example,
internet
yeah.
consumption and usage? Yeah, I think look, you'll find a lot of investors who will
Mm-hmm.
claim they were ready for it. I think the truth is, uh, as time has shown, because of the fact that the form factor on the mobile changed, look, some things remain true in terms of human psychology and what is needed to be solved for user delight, consumption behaviors. But what has since shown us is the phone by itself, because it's different. It's a device which has its unique characteristics, which the laptop, for example, never allowed. It unlocked
Sure,
completely new models. So, for example, if you were too fixated on what an internet model is supposed to represent, you might be myopic and miss the
I agree.
larger opportunity which the
So,
mobile
like I said,
represented.
I've never been a part of the let's say age of mobile app startups. Um, but when I came in, the e-commerce bubble was still ongoing, and I will share the observation that I have seen investment teams that had a lot of exposure over the years to the e-commerce I don't know, craze or hype and successes, etc., really struggle to adapt to new spaces for a few years. They underwent, and I have seen some of them that underwent a really poor vintage after that, as they tried to adapt to enterprise SaaS, and other investors
Yes.
had caught, let's say, competence in that field, perhaps one or two vintages earlier, etc. So I have seen that, and yeah, when that space sort of runs out, or perhaps it runs on a lower steam, lower repetition of ambitious projects, etc., yeah, then you either need to adapt your fund strategy to perhaps only invest in the smaller or sorry, fewer concentrated winners that now come up, or you need to find new pastures, to hunt on.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, how often has it happened that some of the investors that you've which fit the persona that you described have spoken to ventures in B2B or in construction where we've come across, where they give advice where we know for a fact it has actually no or
Yeah.
very little relevance to their success, but seems to be like randomly airlifted out of some B2C
Yeah, a lot
commerce
between
playbook.
2019 to 2024. It happened less in the last year, but not for the right reason. It happened less in the last year because they were preoccupied with doing the same to AI companies. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Okay, so that
that's
was
right.
maybe one topic. Just, hey, what kinds of examples are we talking about? So then, how do you know it's happening to you as a VC firm? How do you know you're kind of undergoing this phase shift?
I'll tell you why I thought of this topic. Maybe that can give us a launch off point. So, uh, what you obviously know, Patrick, but I'll say it out loud. More of the investments that I've done and maybe tasted some scale in have been fit more supply chain or marketplace sort of aspects, and I don't have much exposure in what could be called deep tech or hardware oriented companies and so on. Now, the interesting thing is a few opportunities that have recently really got me excited from a very in a very core intellectual way, from a point of view of what I see as being strategically very important for the near term future, fit the description of what I can only call inventions. And I'm being very deliberate by calling them inventions, right? I'm not very specific here because the setups and all have a track record of creating inventions. So evaluating the possibility of taking inventions to a venture setting, and that is where I'm finding myself having to retrain my method, um, retraining my or calibrating my compass, right, if you want to use that analogy, on how I look at these opportunities. What I'm constantly asking myself, which is why it's more of an almost an open debate and not necessarily a conclusion: do I run the risk of prematurely getting excited with insufficient knowledge basis or insufficient track record, which is the classic chicken and egg sort of problem a VC probably finds themselves in? Next, I sometimes find myself asking, hey, at some point I will obviously have to dive in, otherwise I'll always stay in my comfort zone. So, in some ways, the opposite of what I said. The third, ultimately, you and I are responsible for delivering excellent returns. So, frankly, why even bother if we can play the right game and do it better? Why even bother trying to do other things, right? And obviously, there's other thoughts going on as well. So, it's in that sort of philosophical mindset that I thought this would be an interesting debate to have.
I get that. I'm still asking myself, though, if I'm in the middle of this phase shift where I need to unlearn my prior experience to be ready and actively proceed on learning the next part of my skill set that will make me a great picker in the next era or vintage or archetype of success, however you want to think of it. How do I know that I'm in the middle of this
Yes.
phase shift? And maybe I don't have to know. Maybe it's just an ongoing phase shift all the time.
Yeah. Oof, that's a very tricky question. Anecdotally, what I've found, unfortunately, talking to other VCs is like the
Mm.
least helpful way to recognize it.
Yeah, there
But
I get a phase
talking,
shift every year. It's like Web
yeah,
three, climate, or climate 2.0, I should say. AI, energy, defense. Next year, so like there, everything feels like a phase shift.
something, yeah, yeah. So I feel like as you and I have seen, I think you and I had to go through this sort of unlearning in
Yeah.
the early years of fundamental, and I think maybe we're still going through parts of it even now, even after all these years. I feel like the unlearning is helped because you and I have both been, I guess, moved by sheer action happening at a grassroots level, at a company level, not necessarily shaped by narrative of any kind, at a company level. When that happens, it's hard to overlook. Frankly, you should not be overlooking it. Is my opinion. If you're an investor, you should, in that case, embrace it and see why those changes and those that momentum is building up, even if there's no narrative. In some other case, it may be a slightly longer term bet where the right sort of conditions are shaping up for a change, and you're looking for, referencing again the pre-episode 2 minute discussion you and I have, there is a void which needs to be filled, or at least that's a view you could form, and it's sort of seeking out like a perfect team to fill that void, and if that team happens to come, potentially they could start with an enormous unfair advantage. Now, of course, where it gets very very tricky is how much of it is you convincing yourself
Hmm.
that that's the story versus that actually being a reflection of where reality
Hmm.
is heading in the future. That's the tricky part.
Hmm. Yeah. So I guess for me, it's almost natural to. I'm a very curious person, and I'm not hungry for knowledge per se. That's part of it. I'm hungry for relevant insight. There's this mantra that someone beat into me early in my career, which is, Patrick, information without decision is useless. Decision without action is useless, which means that if information doesn't
Mhm.
facilitate decision, doesn't facilitate action, don't bother getting the information. It just, unless you're in research, of course, we're talking about, so that was in the context of business, right? Being an
Mhm.
executive or being a founder, this is relevant. So my curiosity is always geared towards when I can see an information that allows me to make a decision. I'm like a sponge. I'm like, I can spend my entire weekend on something. Whereas if it's an information that is just super nice to have, I'm not curious in that way. There are people who sponge up information just to learn about everything in the world. I admire that. And if I have too much free time, I probably also be that, but I'm also pretty pragmatic prioritizer. And that's how I prioritize. But then when I have this kind of
Mhm.
information, I dig in. And so it's relevant for this context because for me, I think I'm just constantly assuming we're in a phase shift, because whenever I see something that makes me take a decision, perhaps on a deal or not a deal, or where I prioritize my time to have a prepared mind, any information that will help me do that is a good one. And it allows me then to eliminate as many assumptions as possible. That's another part of, I think you and I share that mindset very much. So minimizing
Yes.
premises, etc.
Yes.
I guess I don't know. I'm in a constant being hunted mode. I'm in a constant survival and constant phase shift kind of a mode. Hey, it's happening. And I mean, there's another thing for you and my. We're the millennial generation, right? So born in the 80s. And I think one of the things that is not being talked about your and my generation is we are the first generation that felt the slowness of no internet and no mobile phone, then
Mhm.
felt the mobile phone, then felt the beginning of the internet with, 28.8 kbps
Yes.
modem. It was how I started. Then felt the
Yeah.
more mobile, then felt the more social. You know exactly what I'm saying, right? So we're the first generation that can literally can compare offline to how rapidly everything changes. A journalist recently told me, I'm
Yes.
sure other people have heard this. I had never heard it, but it kind of checks out. By Thursday, you have consumed as much information
Mhm.
as a person in the Middle Ages in their entire lifetime.
You mean the first
Correct.
4 days in a week?
It's nuts to
Oh,
think about, hard to prove, but
wow.
kind of checks out, right? Kind of checks out.
I can believe
And
that
that's
actually. Yeah, I can
accelerating,
believe
right? And
that.
sorry, again, let me tie that back to the topic. Because we're that first generation, it, it I feel constantly challenged to keep up with more and more and more
Hmm.
information and absorb it, prioritize or filter it, prioritize it, and then put that into a decision and into an action. I think the generation after us is not at an advantage there because for them it will not feel chased. It will always feel like, I mean, that's just normal. That's like Blade Runner 2048, skyscrapers and everything is plastered with ads, constant
Hmm.
neurological bombardment or stimulus, etc. To you and me, we didn't start that way.
Yes.
So it's literally the
Yeah.
appreciation of I have to deal with it, I have to cope with it, to sift through that noise. I think is very unique to our generation. And that's not being talked about. And that puts me in a constant, okay, I'm being chased and I have to stay ahead of the game kind of a mode with regard to information collection.
Yeah. I think so. I agree with what you said. It's also a very interesting way of presenting how we are
Mm.
primed in a certain way to accept that change is inevitable, and the way it goes without feeling like we're being rushed into it, or it might represent something of an unpleasant nature. I also liked one line that you put in there, which I think uh, I'm surprised I didn't bring it up earlier, and I think it uniquely forms a part of how you and I looked at evolving is being able to sort of live with the change or accept a new playbook without having to make overwhelming sets of assumptions. If we can get there or become champions of that playbook or the new model with what we consider a reasonable set of assumptions that we are comfortable with, I think you and I then were like, okay, you know what? Based on this, I can sign up for this. But I think beyond a certain set of assumptions, where it might start to take a more visionary flavor and stuff like that, which we are not able to, or which we don't see being able to underwrite. I think that's when we'll be like, hey, we need more
Mm,
evidence at this point, and we won't just accept it at face value.
I agree. So I guess what we're saying is it's a constant race, a constant phase shift. It's not like you notice, oh, now it has happened. It's like literally ongoing all the time.
Yeah.
Then maybe the third part of this conversation could be, okay, so what could be the strategies that a VC, by extrapolation, maybe a company, um, could deal with it?
Hmm.
I can think of a few strategies. If you want, I can kick us off here. Okay, let me
Please.
just map out the strategies that I have in my mind. Feel free to add, we can pick them, etc. So I think the first one is um, that you revert back to something a little bit more timeless, a little bit that directly influences the learning, and that is okay. I just refine my taste about founders. I don't bother at all about my own opinion about a space or market opportunity, technology, etc. The second one could be you move downstream and you go into growth rounds with your strategy where you have a ton of legibility of a company and you don't have to be bothered with, okay, what is my projection on this topic 5 to 10 years out? So that could be a second strategy. A third strategy is that you build 100+ portfolio size. It's a very solid strategy, statistically proven. Again, you just don't bother to
Yeah.
deal with understanding any of the phase shifts that are ongoing. You are maybe again picking either by market or very broad market, I should say, or founders, or maybe even signal investors. That's another strategy that these portfolio builders can also pursue. Um, what else? I mean, these are three strategies that come to my mind. If you don't want to get obsolete on outdated knowledge and letting that influence poor picking, I don't know. Any other strategy coming to your mind?
So I would also maybe consider doing more primary knowledge building. And I'm being very deliberate again when I use these words, primary knowledge building. So, for example, this would not comprise of reading startup publications or following VC opinions or startup founder opinions or um, daily news updates on what is important or what is trending, etc. But getting into the makeup of the industry, what is possible, what is not possible, how previously or existing incumbents in successful companies, what made them successful, and in that process, therefore, understand what their success is
Mm.
dependent on, and therefore, if there be a challenger, you need to contend with those factors that the incumbents already have in place. And with from there, I would, and this is my own method, I don't know if to what extent it might apply to others, try to create a mind map of possibilities. If at all you need to find a company that fits this description, what sort of characteristics it should
Mm.
have or would have. Now, obviously, in a real scenario, no company will come with a perfect match with
Yeah.
whatever you have in mind. But I think at least it prepares you to intellectually come equipped. In a, with the analogy of a boxing match or a wrestling match, you're not completely underprepared. So if you don't do your own preparation and diligence, you run the risk of being like either not having a clue, not
Yeah.
understanding anything, and
Yeah.
therefore not being impressed, or you get too easily impressed with visionary aspects. And I think either of those situations is
I
not
think the way you're
the way to
describing
go.
it would also fall into my fourth strategy. Tell me if it's the same. So I think fourth strategy is basically that you pick markets earlier than others, or you pick opportunities earlier than others. And you make it literally, and sorry, that is relevant here because you literally make it your mindset of, okay, I constantly need to pick something ahead of the curve before others are
Yes.
hyping it or understanding it. It sounds like that's very similar to your prepared mind. Okay. Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's perhaps the
Yes.
fourth one. Um, yeah, and then the fifth strategy could be that you just try to be an expert in everything. I am not so sure that is solving this. So, for example, you could say, okay, I'm building the biggest investment team, I'm building the biggest operations team, I'm building the biggest network. I actually think that mostly amplifies your problem because that also amplifies the chances that the people that you hire will have that legacy knowledge unlearning actually injected into it, and they will have
Yeah.
conversations about it. Those conversations are end to end. So n number of people to n number of people
Mhm.
in your organization, that actually amplifies the problem. So while that might look like an appropriate response, it might actually create the exact opposite effect for you and strengthen the problem. So I think for you and me, strategy 2, not a strategy, so become a growth fund. Strategy 3, portfolio size, abstraction, or huge granularity, also not our strategy. So that leaves.
Mhm.
And sorry, we're debating it as if we're debating it. We already know what we're doing, but let's role play a little bit. So strategy 1, go timeless, founder. Maybe we can debate that one what we're seeing, and we can debate the fourth strategy.
Sure.
So on the founder
Mhm.
thing, right? I said to you in the pre-brief when you proposed the subject, I said, Shub, isn't that exactly why or how every of the oldest venture investment firms that has been around since the 70s, right, would typically say they have cracked the code of founders or they are extremely founder driven and they need to understand how the founder is capable of building a huge business. Isn't that the reason the ability to deal with these phase shifts, because these companies that have been investing for 50 plus years have undergone so many phase shifts as part of their investment career as a firm that they know this is
Mhm.
happening, and this is sort of their response to, okay, you know what, rather than trying to keep up with everything, let's back the people who we are paying to keep up with everything, and let's just become the best picker of those people. I think that's actually a key reason to it.
Absolutely. I think interpreted in the context of what we said earlier, to being armed with primary knowledge, having a prepared mind about the space and the opportunity, needs to obviously go alongside that, because keep in mind some of the same firms who have picked those visionary companies or the iconic companies from the 70s and 80s have also backed some pretty interesting ones more
Mm.
recently as well, right? And and when I say interesting, I mean interesting in quotes, right? So, applying the same sort of playbooks, right? So, what I mean by that is, actually, let me think of the right words to use for what I'm trying to express. Okay, so I think, at least in my mind, and you and I quite often have debates about this about this. So, what I mean is, when judging founders or using playbooks or methods on determining whether the founder is the right one for this opportunity, I feel quite often it is abstracted to a level where the question is asked of, hey, do we like this founder or not, etc., and then it can be abstracted away from the opportunity and the fit
Hmm.
for the opportunity. Whereas I feel like, so the examples you mentioned from the 70s, 80s, etc., my hunch, I mean, I don't know if that was actually going on, and I guess maybe it's not fully possible to determine if that happened. Perhaps those the best decisions, best investment decisions were taken in the context of the market opportunity and the founder fit. I'm not saying you're not. It is not what you. I'm not saying you didn't say that, but I think sometimes the way it's interpreted in venture land is to take the concept of, hey, founder, and glorifying
Let,
it
let me
to
let
a
me inject
different
something
degree.
from this week. So the colleague, I'm not giving the colleague's name, but I had an interesting conversation with a colleague of ours, right? And so, we do, like every good firm, you're trying to help other colleagues level up. They help you level up, etc. Right? And so somehow the conversation came up how his mindset about a certain part of the venture market, a geography, has changed since he started his investment career, which is several years ago. And I called him and I said,
Mhm.
hey, I've noticed you said something about that geography and the investors and the founders in that geography. It was an internal meeting that seemed so different to what you said with confidence when you started your career, not started your career, but like he was maybe a year into that and he had spent a lot of time in that
Sure.
geography, etc. I said, I couldn't help but notice it. It sounded very different from what you had said before. And
Mhm.
then that got into a really good conversation and he was so thoughtful about it. So I'm glad I caught him. I called him because you could sense he had actually undergone an internal conflict for weeks about just all
Mm.
this new kind of reading of that market. And one of the things that he said is, yeah, you know what? I'm noticing how investors in this geography justify investing in founders for absolutely ridiculous reasons. I said, give me an example. This is a real example, Shub. I'm not kidding you. I mean, I can pull it up on Slack, but I can also say it by memory. He said, yeah, this one investor at this firm was a good firm, respected firm, etc. He wrote in his investment memo and then sold the firm to me saying, yeah, that guy was a debater in high school, and that's why we should back him. I was like, huh?
Mhm.
Like how is that a relevant argument to this whole conversation that this investor was making? And so this colleague of ours, he had kind of seen enough of that level of judgment or level of arguing to now undergo this development on his own and realize that's not an appropriate way how to figure out whether a founder is my taste or not my taste or timeless or can crack this opportunity during a phase shift or not. But that's not an
Mhm.
exception. That's happening all the time. To your point, people find any kind of random argument to say that car is red and that's why we should buy it. The one has nothing to do with the other. So why do you use it as an argument? And that happens with VCs justifying founder picks all the time too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, firstly, I'm not surprised at this finding made by our colleague. In fact, I think I would even go to the extent of saying it is perhaps happening in the majority of cases where we see investments are made, where you're like force fitting uh, what I would call random attributes and describing them as reasons for describing
Yeah.
founders as high quality. But that's what it happens when your playbook becomes either a checklist or needing to fit into a form of saying, hey, we are
Yeah.
founders first, or whatever, you then need to
I'm
force fit
looking
all
at a
these
few other
things.
great quotes that he had shared with me from investors in that region that had made him rethink his stance. Another one that he heard was, I felt good about the founders. I mean, why did you feel good? That would be an interesting question to answer to that question.
Yeah.
And then they are aware of their blind spots, and that's why I invested. Again, I mean, that's hopefully 50% of the world population. All right, give me 20. Yeah.
Actually, I mean, if you dig into that, and you probably have come to that realization as well, isn't that exactly
I think
confirmation
so. That's
bias?
literally looking for arguments to justify an emotion about wanting to invest. It's exactly what it is.
Yeah. So yes, but the specific example you said about the founder knowing their blind spots. So it's confirmation bias within confirmation bias.
You have to walk me through.
So for example, if I were to confidently assert that I
Yeah.
know all my blind spots,
Ah,
what does that say about? So it means that I'm denying the existence of, I forget, there's another 2 by 2 matrix where it's
yeah.
blind to me
Yeah.
but visible to others or not. So I'm confidently acknowledging, or denying, rather denying and maybe deluding myself that
Yeah.
that part doesn't exist. So
I
yeah.
mean, I personally think that the reverting back to just refining your own taste in founders and not bothering with the phase shift at all, in theory, is a valid principle. And I do also think that you and I know a few investors whom I would trust to do that over time, over decades. I think there are actually people like that. However, I will say
Yeah.
I do not think they live in big firms. And I tell you why. So going back to the example that you just said, if that were the case, wouldn't the people in the big firms who had backed Apple and Nvidia, Intel, hardware companies, hardware startups in the 80s, shouldn't they also have backed the same founders who built Anduril earlier than anyone else? Didn't see them there.
Fair. Yeah.
In fact, I saw them, no, hardware is not our thing. So are you really founder focused then? Because if
Yeah.
you already make exclusions about hardware, or, oh, I don't like construction, I mean, I got that a lot in 2019,
Yes.
etc.
Yes.
Just saying, right? So
Mhm.
I think there are people who have refined that. I don't think they live in big firms.
I think you're largely correct.
Okay, so that's one strategy. The other strategy that you were highlighting is basically prepared mind and picking markets earlier. So I'll let you take this one, but I will just say when I look at terrific outperforming funds and the positions that they had, why they outperformed, there's no 100% answer to this, but I'm in my own analysis over the last, I don't know, year or so with regard to that topic, I'm more than 50% into I'm into more than 50% of the positions that made them become 10x funds were actually emerging markets, geographically emerging markets or topically emerging markets.
Yeah.
I'm very convinced of that strategy.
Yeah. I share your conviction on that hypothesis. I would agree with that as well. And I think, which is why I think, or at least my hunch is, not necessarily knowing the inner workings of some of these investors. I think it might have been a case of the opportunity meeting a prepared mind, because at various points of time when they entered those opportunities, they weren't quite obvious, either for thematic reasons or geographic reasons, sometimes both,
I mean,
etc.
how many rejects did Airbnb get, Brian Chesky? I think he posted it sometime. It was dozens.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So in a way,
Yeah.
maybe that was an emerging category. Don't know, but I think by and large, Now, that doesn't explain fully the set of 10x outperforming funds, but it explains, I swear to you, more than 50% of the value contribution or of the outperforming funds.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if
So
that is not the case. I'm quite
once
sure
you're
that is
realizing that, your
yeah,
whole hunt becomes about emerging markets and emerging opportunities. And so then
yeah.
actually the phase shift is your business.
Yes.
So,
Actually, that's very well put. Yeah, that's
and
right.
it seems to me that's what we're about.
Very much, sir. Very
At least
much.
we're trying, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Okay. Very
Yes.
good, sir. Happy weekend. Cheers.
Happy weekend, sir.